The cold was a living thing. It seeped through the threadbare wool of her tunic, sank its teeth into her bones, and made a home in the marrow. Alara knelt on the great hall's flagstones, the icy stone leaching the last of her body's meager warmth. Her fingers were raw, the skin split and bleeding from the harsh lye soap and the relentless scrubbing. She was an omega, less than nothing. A ghost that haunted the edges of the pack, visible only when there was a mess to be cleaned or a harsh word to be thrown. Her parents had been exiles from a rival pack, granted sanctuary but never acceptance. They had died in a fever winter when she was small, leaving her with their legacy of shame. She was a stray, a burden, a thing to be tolerated until she was old enough to be cast out for good. The scent of pine and stale ale was thick in the air, a familiar perfume of her servitude. She dipped her rag into the bucket of frigid, greasy water, her muscles screaming in protest. Just this floor, she told herself, the same lie she used every day. Just get through this, and then you can find a corner to curl up in, to be invisible again. A sharp kick to her ribs sent her sprawling. The bucket tipped, sending a wave of icy water across the stones and soaking her completely. A gasp of pain and shock was stolen from her lungs by the impact. "Filth," a voice sneered from above. "Can't even scrub a floor without making a bigger mess." Alara looked up, blinking water from her lashes. Vestra stood over her, the pack alpha's daughter, her lips curled in a familiar expression of contempt. Her fine leather boots were inches from Alara's face, pristine and dry. Behind her, two of her sycophants giggled, their laughter like chipping ice. "You're pathetic," Vestra continued, nudging Alara's shoulder with the toe of her boot. "A worthless scrap. My father should have left you in the snow with your traitor parents." The words were blades, each one honed by years of practice. They slid into Alara's heart, finding the old wounds and twisting. Humiliation burned hot in her cheeks, a stark contrast to the deathly cold of her drenched clothes. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to become one with the stone beneath her. But she did not. Deep inside, beneath the layers of fear and self-loathing, a tiny, stubborn ember refused to be extinguished. It was a spark of defiance she never dared to show, a secret core of strength that had kept her alive this long. She pushed herself up, her movements stiff and aching. She didn't meet Vestra's eyes. That would be a challenge, and she knew the price of that. Instead, she focused on the spilled water, the task now doubled. She gritted her teeth, the sound a faint scrape in the vast hall. Her jaw ached with the effort of holding back a sob, not of sadness, but of a white-hot rage she could never afford to unleash. She reached for her rag, her hand shaking. Vestra scoffed, bored by the lack of reaction. "Clean it up, and if it's not gleaming by the time the hunters return, you'll feel the lash tonight." She swept away, her followers trailing in her wake like jackals. Alara was left alone again, kneeling in a puddle of her own misery. The cold was worse now, a physical weight pressing down on her. Shivering violently, she picked up the rag and began to scrub, her own silent tears mixing with the dirty water on the floor. The great horn blew an hour later, its mournful cry echoing through the valley. It was the warning, the call. A white fang was coming. It was not just a blizzard. It was a storm with a name, a sentient monster of wind and ice that descended from the northern peaks once a generation. The elders spoke of it in hushed, fearful tones. It was a time of testing, a culling of the weak. Panic, sharp and immediate, seized the hold. Pack members rushed to secure the great doors, to reinforce the shutters, but Alara felt a different kind of dread. For her, the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm within the pack's traditions. To appease the winter spirit, to prove their strength against the White Fang, a ritual hunt was called. The pack's strongest warriors would venture into the teeth of the blizzard to bring down a great elk, and the Omegas would be the beaters. It was a death sentence. They were meant to be flushed out, to drive the prey with their scent and their fear, their worthless bodies serving a final, useful purpose. Few, if any, ever returned. Garrick, the pack's lead enforcer and Vestra's brutish suitor, found her by the hearth, trying to steal a moment of warmth. He grabbed her by her thin arm, his fingers digging in like talons. "You're up, Scrap," he grunted, his breath smelling of sour mead. "Time to earn your keep." He dragged her toward the entrance, where the other 3 Omegas, 2 old men and a terrified young boy, were already huddled, their faces pale with resignation. They were given nothing but thin cloaks, no weapons, no hope. The great doors groaned open, and the White Fang roared in. The wind was a physical blow, a wall of ice and snow that stole her breath and blinded her. It sliced like claws, tearing at her exposed skin. The hunters, clad in thick furs, howled with savage excitement. Alara and the others were shoved out into the maelstrom. "Spread out! Drive the beasts north!" Garrick bellowed over the wind's shriek. The world was a whirlwind of white. Snow flew so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The cold was a new entity now, an active predator. It burned her lungs with every breath. Within minutes, she was separated from the others, lost in the howling chaos. Was this it? Was this how her miserable life ended? Alone and frozen in a storm, a forgotten footnote in the pack's history. She stumbled forward, driven by some primal instinct to just keep moving. Her feet were numb, her face a mask of ice. The wind screamed in her ears, a chorus of mocking voices. She pushed through a thicket of pine, the snow-laden branches dumping their load on her. The ground beneath her suddenly vanished. She cried out, a thin sound swallowed by the storm, as she tumbled downward. It wasn't a cliff, but a steep, snow-slicked ravine. She rolled, momentum gathering, rocks and ice scraping at her. She hit the bottom with a jarring thud that knocked the last of the air from her body. For a long moment, she lay there, stunned, the snow piling up around her. Pain flared in her shoulder, sharp and insistent. She was alive. Somehow. Slowly, groaning, she pushed herself to her knees. The ravine offered some shelter from the worst of the wind. It was here, in the relative quiet, that she heard it. A low, pained groan. It was not human. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through her daze. A bear? A winter cat? She crawled forward, peering through the swirling snow. Her eyes widened. It was a wolf. A monster of a wolf, larger than any she had ever seen. Its fur was the color of a starless midnight sky, now matted with snow and dark, steaming blood. A massive, splintered pine tree lay across its hindquarters, pinning it to the frozen ground. A deep gash ran along its flank, the source of the blood that stained the snow a sickening crimson. Its breathing was shallow, ragged. But it was the eyes that held her. Even half-closed in agony, they held a faint, fading glow. Amber embers in the encroaching dark. She could smell the power coming off it in waves, a scent of ancient forests, lightning, and undisputed authority. This was no mere animal. This was something else entirely. Something old and terrifying and dying. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to climb out of the ravine and take her chances with the storm. A predator like this, even injured, could snap her in two. but she couldn't move. She saw the pain in its eyes, the slow surrender to the inevitable. She saw a reflection of her own life, trapped, wounded, and alone. A strange, reckless compassion bloomed in her chest, overriding the fear. No one deserved to die like this, not even a monster. Shivering uncontrollably from cold and terror, she crept closer. The wolf's head lifted a fraction of an inch, a low rumble vibrating in its chest. A warning. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, her voice cracking. The words were absurd. A mouse promising a lion it meant no harm. She reached the beast's side, her gaze fixed on the terrible wound. It needed pressure. It needed warmth. It needed a miracle. She had none of those things to give. All she had was herself. Taking a shaky breath, she reached out. Her small, raw hand, chapped and bleeding, moved through the space between them. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then pressed her palm gently against the matted fur near the wound. The world ended. A supernova of white-hot energy erupted from the point of contact. It was not light, but the essence of it, pure and blinding. A scream was torn from her throat as a searing, unimaginable pain shot up her arm, a fire that branded her soul. It felt like a star was being born inside her veins. The air cracked with a sound like shattering worlds. The snow around them vaporized in an instant, leaving a perfect circle of steaming, bare earth. The storm above the ravine seemed to pause, the wind holding its breath. The wolf's eyes shot wide open. The faint amber was gone, replaced by a blazing, molten gold. They were not eyes anymore. They were twin suns, burning with a terrifying and ancient intelligence. Power, raw and untamed, poured from him, a physical force that pressed her back. With a sound of splintering thunder, the massive pine tree pinning him was blasted into sawdust. The wolf rose, not as a wolf, but as something else. The form shifted, bones cracking and reforming in a fluid, impossible transformation. Where the beast had been, a man now stood. He was impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, a titan carved from mountain stone and winter fury. His naked skin steamed in the cold air, his body a roadmap of old scars and corded muscle. Long black hair, wild as the storm, fell around a face that was brutally, predatorily beautiful. A face of sharp angles and harsh lines made for command and conquest. And his eyes, those molten gold eyes, were fixed on her. He took a step forward, his gaze dropping to her wrist. Alara followed his look. There, seared into her skin, was a mark. It was an intricate, swirling pattern of silver lines, like a spiral galaxy or a frost flower, glowing with a soft internal light. The source of the fire that still hummed in her blood. He looked back at her face, and his expression was one of stupefied awe, of 100-year winter finally breaking. He spoke her name, though she had never told it to him, his voice a deep rumble like an avalanche and a vow. Alara. He took another step, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as it cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The touch sent another jolt of lightning through her, but this one was not painful. It was a connection, a current of pure life. Mine, he whispered, the single word in absolute, unbreakable declaration. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact that the universe itself seemed to bend to acknowledge. Alara's mind was a maelstrom of terror and confusion. Who was this man? What was happening? The mark on her wrist pulsed with a warm, steady rhythm, a silent drumbeat that echoed the pounding of her own heart. A part of her, a deep, primal instinct she never knew she possessed, sang in response to his touch. It screamed mate, safe, home, forever. It urged her to lean into his strength, to seek shelter in his arms. But the rest of her, the part that had been forged in 19 years of cruelty and neglect, screamed danger, trap, run. Power like his was to be feared. Men like him did not look at girls like her with anything but disdain. This was a trick, a cruel dream before the freezing death claimed her. She flinched back, pulling away from his touch as if burned. She scrambled backward on the damp earth, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who are you?" she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "What did you do to me?" A flicker of something, hurt, surprise, crossed his features before being replaced by an unreadable mask. "I am Kaelin," he said, his voice softer now but still carrying the weight of command. "And I did nothing. This," he gestured to the glowing mark on her wrist, "is what we did, together." Kaelin. The name echoed in the deepest recesses of her memory. Stories told by shivering travelers. The Alpha King, the supreme leader of all the packs in the north. A warrior of legend, ancient and ruthless, who had not been seen in these lands for a century. It was impossible. He was a myth. And yet, the sheer, overwhelming power radiating from him was undeniable. He was real. And he was looking at her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever seen. "You are her," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "The one I have waited for." He took a step and she flinched again. He stopped, a sigh of frustration escaping his lips. He was clearly not a man accustomed to patience. He raked a hand through his damp hair. From the corner of her eye, she saw that the gash on his side was gone, leaving only smooth, unblemished skin. Her touch had healed him. What was happening to me? Before he could speak again, a harsh shout echoed from the lip of the ravine. "Down there! I saw a light!" Alara's blood ran cold. It was Garrick's voice. In moments, several figures appeared above them, dark silhouettes against the swirling white of the storm. Garrick was at the forefront, and beside him, Vestra. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, the giant, naked man who radiated power, and the shivering Omega girl kneeling before him. Then Vestra's gaze fell upon Alara's wrist. The mark was still glowing softly, a beacon in the gloom. A look of pure, venomous hatred twisted her beautiful features. "That scrap?" she spat, her voice dripping with disbelief and fury. "With him?" Garrick's eyes, however, were gleaming with a different emotion. Cunning, ambition. He saw not the impossible connection, but the opportunity. He saw the legendary Alpha King, weakened and disoriented. He saw the king's fated mate, a worthless Omega who could be easily controlled. Kaelin moved, placing his massive body between Alara and the newcomers. He was unarmed and unclothed, but he seemed more dangerous than any 10 warriors. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that promised death. "Leave," Kaelin commanded. It was not a request. Garrick laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The great Alpha King. Looking a little exposed, are we?" He drew a long, wicked-looking blade from his belt. The other hunters with him did the same. They were foolish, emboldened by their numbers and their alpha's arrogance. "Garrick, no," Vestra hissed, a flicker of fear in her eyes. "You don't know who he is." I know exactly who he is, Garrick sneered, his eyes locked on Kaelin. And I know who I serve. He gave a sharp nod to his men. He's injured. Take him. The girl comes with us. The last thing Alara registered was a secret symbol Garrick flashed with his hand, a coiled serpent eating a flame, the mark of the Ember Covenant, a dark cult that whispered of overthrowing the old pacts. Kaelin moved like a blur of shadow and fury. The first man to reach him died with a shattered neck before his blade even completed its swing. Kaelin was a whirlwind of primal violence, his fists and feet striking with lethal force. But he was still recovering. He had poured so much of his energy into the transformation, into surviving the wound, and they were many. While Kaelin was occupied, Vestra saw her chance. She scrambled down the side of the ravine, her face a mask of jealous rage. She lunged for Alara. "You will not have him!" she shrieked, her nails clawing for Alara's face. Alara cried out, scrambling away, but Vestra was faster, stronger. She tackled Alara, sending them both to the ground. In Vestra's hand was a thin, coiled chain. It glinted with a dull, sickly sheen. Silver. With a triumphant cry, Vestra wrapped the chain tightly around Alara's marked wrist. Pain, absolute and soul-shattering, exploded from the mark. It wasn't the clean fire of its creation, but a vile, corrosive agony. The light in the brand sputtered and died, replaced by a cold, aching void. The connection to Kaelin, the warm, humming presence that had just begun to fill the emptiness inside her, was snuffed out. She screamed, a raw, desperate sound. Across the clearing, Kaelin staggered as if struck by a physical blow. He roared her name, his voice filled with anguish. The psychic backlash of the bond being severed hit him hard. That momentary distraction was all Garrick needed. He brought the pommel of his sword down hard on the back of Kaelin's head. The Alpha King fell to one knee, shaking his head to clear it. "Get her out of here!" Garrick yelled. Vestra hauled Alara to her feet. The world was swimming in a haze of pain. The emptiness in her chest was a gaping wound, far worse than any physical injury. It felt as if her soul had been torn in half. She was being dragged away, up the side of the ravine. She saw Kaelin fighting to rise, his golden eyes wild with fury and despair, locked on her. His men were swarming him, trying to bind him. Then they were over the edge of the ravine, and he was gone. The cold and the pain and the terrible, terrible emptiness were all that remained. The journey was a blur of misery. They dragged her through the raging blizzard, the silver chain on her wrist a constant source of agony, each link a burning coal against her skin. The cold was nothing compared to the chill in her soul. The bond, that miraculous, terrifying connection, was now a source of torment. It was a hollow space inside her that screamed with his absence. They arrived at a hidden fortress, a jagged spire of black rock that seemed to claw at the stormy sky. It was a place of shadows and cold stone, devoid of any warmth or life. The sigil of the Ember Covenant was carved above the great iron gate. She was thrown into a cell. It was small, damp, and utterly dark. The silver chain was bolted to the wall, keeping her tethered like an animal. She curled into a ball on the filthy straw, the pain a constant, throbbing presence. Hours or days might have passed. Time had no meaning in the darkness. Her hope, a fragile seedling that had dared to sprout in that ravine, withered and died. Of course it was a lie. Of course she wasn't destined for anything but pain. She was Alara the worthless, Alara the scrap. A king could never want her. This was her reality. This was her cage. The cell door creaked open, spilling faint torchlight into the gloom. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was tall and slender, wrapped in robes of shadow and ash. He moved with a silent grace that was more terrifying than any brute force. "The little catalyst," he said, his voice a dry whisper like leaves skittering over a tombstone. "I am Lord Malachor." He stepped into the cell and the temperature dropped even further. He radiated a palpable aura of ancient malice and dark power. He crouched before her, his face a pale, ascetic mask. His eyes were pits of darkness. "You are wondering why you are here," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are the key. The Alpha King's strength has long been a thorn in my side, but his greatest strength is also his greatest weakness. A fated mate." Malachor reached out, his long, cold fingers tracing the deadened mark on her wrist, right over the silver chain. Alara flinched away, a whimper escaping her lips. "This bond," Malachor mused, "is a conduit of immense power, forged in the very heart of creation, a power I intend to claim. We will perform a ritual. We will use you to open the conduit, and then we will sever it, redirecting the torrent of raw energy into me. When it is done, he will be a broken shell, and I will have the power to remake this world in my own image." He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw nothing but a chilling abyss. "Your only purpose, little Omega, is to be the vessel and the sacrifice. Your life has been worthless until this moment. Now it will serve a grand design." He rose and swept out of the cell, leaving her in darkness once more. His words echoed in her mind, confirming every terrible thing she had ever believed about herself. A key, a tool, a sacrifice. Worthless. Despair, thick and suffocating, settled over her. This was the end. There was no escape. Kaelin was captured or dead. She was alone. The aching void in her chest was a constant scream. She closed her eyes, tears finally tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. She focused on that void, on the memory of the warmth that had filled it for just a few fleeting moments. She pictured his golden eyes, the way he had said her name, the possessive declaration of that single, world-altering word. Mine. She poured all her grief, all her pain, all her fading hope into that memory. She reached for him across the distance, through the pain and the silver and the stone. Kaelin. The thought was not a word, but a cry from her very soul. And a voice answered. It was not a sound in her ears, but a roar in the center of her being. It was distant, frayed by pain and rage, but it was his. Alara. The connection was a bare thread, stretched taut and thin, but it was there. She clung to it like a drowning woman to a rope. I am hurt, she thought, sending the feeling of the silver, the cold, the despair. The fury that came back through the bond was staggering. It was the rage of a caged god, a tempest of pure protective instinct. It was so powerful it made her gasp. They will pay, his voice thundered in her mind. Every one of them. Hold on, Alara. Do you hear me? Hold on. I am coming. The thread went silent, but it was enough. The ember of defiance deep within her, the one she thought had been extinguished, flickered. It caught on the fuel of his promise. It began to glow. He was alive. He was coming for her. For the first time in her life, someone was coming for her. She would hold on. They came for her 2 days later. 2 of Malicor's acolytes dragged her from the cell and up a winding stone staircase. The fortress was a hive of activity. Men in dark robes rushed through the corridors, their faces grim. Alara could feel a tension in the air, a deep thrumming of power. The ritual was beginning. They entered a vast circular chamber at the top of the spire. The ceiling was open to the raging blizzard, and snow drifted down onto the floor. In the center of the room was a great stone altar, carved with disturbing, writhing symbols. Lord Malicor stood beside it, holding a cruel-looking blade of obsidian. Vestra and Garrick were there, standing near the far wall. Vestra watched Alara with a triumphant smirk, while Garrick looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the chamber entrance. "The vessel is here," Malicor announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Let the rite commence." The acolytes forced Alara onto the cold stone altar, chaining her wrists and ankles to iron rings. The silver chain was removed from her wrist, and the bond with Kaelin flared back to life, a sudden, dizzying rush of sensation. She could feel him now. He was close. He was so close. And he was filled with a rage that shook the very foundations of the world. Malicor raised the obsidian knife. The symbols on the altar began to glow with a sickly purple light. He began to chant in a language of shadow and pain, the words making the air vibrate. Energy swirled around the room, a vortex of dark magic centering on Alara. She could feel it pulling at the bond, trying to warp it, to corrupt it. "The king is at the gates!" a voice shrieked from the stairwell. Garrick paled. "He's here already? Impossible!" Malicor did not falter. "He is too late," he hissed, his eyes burning with fanatic light. "Once I sever the link, his power will be mine." He lifted the blade high, its dark edge poised over the glowing mark on Alara's wrist. At that exact moment, the entire western wall of the chamber exploded inward. Rock and shrapnel flew through the air as a massive figure burst through the breach. It was Kaelin. He was no longer the wounded man from the ravine. He was the Alpha King, in his full, terrifying glory. He was clad in black iron armor that seemed forged from shadow and moonlight. His golden eyes were blazing infernos, and in his hand he held a great sword that hummed with ancient power. Behind him poured his royal guard, the legendary Silver Claws, their armor gleaming, their weapons ready. They crashed into the Ember Covenant acolytes like a tidal wave of steel and fury. The chamber erupted into a maelstrom of battle. Malicor cursed, turning from the altar to face his nemesis. "You cannot stop this, Kaelin! Her power will be mine!" "You will not touch her," Kaelin roared, his voice the sound of an earthquake. He charged, his greatsword a blur of silver light. Kaelin and Malicor met in the center of the room. Their clash was one of titans. Sword met shadow magic, steel rang against bolts of pure darkness. The force of their blows shook the fortress to its core. Alara could only watch, chained to the altar, her heart in her throat. She saw Kaelin fight with a savagery and grace that was breathtaking. He was a force of nature, a king defending his queen. He fought for her. But Malicor was ancient and cunning. He did not fight with honor. He used every dark trick, every vile spell he had mastered over centuries. He summoned shadowy tendrils from the floor to ensnare Kaelin's legs. He hurled bolts of soul fire that sizzled through the air. Kaelin parried and dodged, his fury giving him strength, but the fight was taking its toll. Malicor found an opening. He unleashed a powerful bolt of black energy wreathed in purple flame. It struck Kaelin square in the chest. The Alpha King cried out, a sound of pure agony, and stumbled backward. The armor on his chest plate cracked and smoked. He fell to one knee, his greatsword clattering on the stone. Seeing him fall, seeing him hurt, seeing the only person who had ever looked at her with anything but contempt brought to his knees because of her. Something inside Alara broke. The years of pain, the constant humiliation, the cold, the hunger, the casual cruelty of Vestra, the chilling pronouncements of Malachor, the terror, the despair, all of it, every last drop of her suffering, ignited. It was not a spark anymore. It was a sun. A blinding, silent detonation of pure white light erupted from her body. It was a light of creation, a light of healing, a light of absolute, righteous fury. It shattered the iron chains holding her as if they were glass. It slammed into the fighting acolytes, not harming the silver claws, but incinerating the covenant members where they stood, turning them to ash. The wave of light washed over Kalen. His wound vanished, the cracks in his armor sealed. He rose to his feet, his strength completely restored, his golden eyes wide with utter awe as he stared at her. Alara stood, no longer chained to the altar but floating inches above it. The light poured from her, a radiant corona that pushed back the shadows and the storm. Her threadbare tunic seemed to shimmer, transformed into a gown of starlight. She was not the shivering Omega anymore. She was power incarnate. Malachor stared at her, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. What are you?" he stammered, his dark magic faltering in the face of her brilliance. She met his gaze, and her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It rang with the clarity of a crystal bell and the force of a collapsing star. It was a voice of command, a voice of truth. "I am his queen." She raised her hand and the light coalesced, focusing into a concentrated beam. It shot across the chamber and struck Malachor. He screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound as the pure, holy energy unmade him. His shadows were burned away, his dark power turned to smoke. His physical form dissolved into nothingness until only a faint dusting of ash remained on the stones. The light receded, gently lowering her back to the altar. The chamber was silent, save for the panting of the victorious Silverclaws and the whistling of the wind through the hole in the wall. The battle was over. Kalen crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. His face was a canvas of emotions, awe, relief, reverence, and a love so profound it stole her breath. He reached her and gently, as if she were made of spun glass, cupped her face in his massive, warm hands. "You saved me," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. His thumbs stroked her cheeks, wiping away tears she hadn't even realized she was crying. "You came for me," she whispered back, her voice trembling slightly now that the incredible power had receded. She leaned into his touch, into his strength, into the overwhelming feeling of safety his presence provided. For the first time in her life, she felt truly, completely safe. He looked down at the mark on her wrist. It was no longer a soft silver. It now blazed with a brilliant, steady silver-gold light, a testament to the power she had unleashed. His gaze was full of wonder. "You are so much more than I ever dreamed," he said softly. Then he held up his own hand. Before her astonished eyes, a matching mark bloomed into existence across the back of his hand and wrist. A perfect, swirling mirror of her own, glowing with the same silver-gold fire. He hadn't just claimed her in that ravine. Here, in this broken fortress, through her act of love and protective fury, she had claimed him in return. The bond was complete, a perfect, unbreakable circle. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but one of deep, soulful connection. It was a promise, a homecoming. It tasted of winter storms, ancient forests, and forever. Days later, she stood on the grand balcony of the Citadel of the North, Kaelin's capital. The city was a marvel of silver spires and stone bridges, nestled in a vast mountain valley. Thousands of his people were gathered in the square below, a sea of upturned faces. Kaelin's arm was a warm, possessive band around her waist. He had dressed her in robes of deep blue velvet lined with white fur, a stark contrast to the rags she had worn her entire life. She felt like an imposter, a child playing dress-up. The self-doubt still whispered at the edges of her mind. But then she felt the steady pulse of the bond, the warmth of his hand on her back, and she stood a little taller. His voice, amplified by a touch of magic, boomed across the square, echoing from the mountains. "People of the North! For centuries your king has walked alone. Today, that changes." He turned slightly, his golden eyes finding hers, filled with a fierce pride that made her heart soar. "Behold, Alara!" he declared, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "My mate, my queen." A moment of stunned silence, and then a roar of approval erupted from the crowd. It was a sound of pure joy and celebration, a wave of acceptance so powerful it shook the very stones of the balcony. They were not cheering a king. They were cheering their king and queen. Alara looked out over the sea of faces, warriors, artisans, children, elders, and for the first time, she did not see judgment or contempt. She saw hope. She saw loyalty. She saw family. Later, in the quiet of their chambers, a fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in. She stood by the window, watching the snow fall softly on the city. She was still processing the whirlwind of the past few days, the fear, the pain, the power, the love. Kaelin came up behind her, wrapping his strong arms around her and pulling her back against his solid chest. He rested his chin on her head, and they watched the snow together in comfortable silence. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "A little," she admitted. "I spent my whole life being invisible. Now, everyone sees me." "I have always seen you," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Even before I met you. I saw you in my dreams for 100 years. A woman with a core of light and a spirit that refused to break. The reality of you is far more magnificent." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "They called me worthless," she whispered, the old poison trying to find purchase one last time. He captured her hand and brought her wrist to his lips, kissing the glowing mark with a reverence that made her tremble. "They were fools," he said, his golden eyes intense. "You are the heart of my kingdom. You are the anchor of my soul. You are my everything." She looked into his eyes and saw her future. It was not a future of scrubbing floors or cowering in corners. It was a future of strength, of love, of belonging. She was no longer Alara the Omega, the outcast, the scrap. She was Alara, Queen of the North, and she was finally, truly, home.